This week, News Talk 870 had an opportunity to catch up with GOP gubernatorial candidate Bill Bryant. He stopped by the News Talk studios, and we had a chance to talk to him about what's happening statewide and nationally, politically, for the races of 2016. And once again, we're keeping an eye on the politics of Washington as John McKay welcoming back a gentleman that's been with us before on the air. You may recall that we were talking with him, getting a lot of attention as a strong gubernatorial candidate, ladies and gentlemen. Bill Bryant, welcome back to the News Talk studios. And to say you've been busy would probably be an understatement.
It would be an understatement, John, but it's always nice to be back in the Tri-Cities. I've been here a lot since we last spoke, and I'll continue to come back over and over again.
You know, to kind of catch people up on the state of gubernatorial affairs, we're not really hearing, and perhaps you can share some insight on this, we're not really hearing a lot of other names out there. I mean, you look at the presidential election, for example, and you've got all these different candidates, but we're not really hearing a lot from other people other than yourself. You're definitely making some waves and getting some attention.
Yeah, I am the Republican candidate for governor, and Jay Inslee, it's presumed, will be the Democrat candidate for governor. So it's really the two of us right now. And I'll tell you, John, the race has really tightened into a horse race. Stuart Elway did a poll over on the coast, but it was a statewide poll in early January, right around New Year's, before a lot of the corrections issues and the Department of Transportation issues broke. And in that poll, it had Governor Inslee at 39. I was 30-31, and 30-31 were undecided. Any governor who is under 50% 10 months before the election is in trouble, and he's at 39. And with 31% of the people undecided, this is a horse race.
You know, that to me mirrors a lot of what we're seeing in some of these presidential caucuses that are going on. They're talking so much about, you know, whether it's Sanders or Clinton or Trump or Cruz, but what they're not really focusing on, and I think this is a neglected aspect of it, are the undecided voters, the people who have not made up their mind. And perhaps, you know, you were with us last year and had an opportunity when you'd kind of started things off. What is a message that you would want to carry out to those folks that are undecided, and perhaps if they're anything like in the presidential race, folks that are kind of a little tired of the political process and they're thinking, well, who am I going to vote for?
Right. When I talk to a lot of these people who are not that political, they're undecided or they're independent voters, one of the things that they like about me is that I'm not a career politician. You know, the governor was a congressman for years and a state legislator before that. His whole career has been in politics. Mine hasn't. The other thing they like is the fact that I've built a company and that it's a company that operates on both sides of the state. My company does international trade negotiations and marketing for agriculture. So I've been coming to the Tri-Cities for decades. I lived in Yakima in the 80s and 90s, and we still have a lot of clients here in the Tri-Cities in the potato industry and a lot of other industries. And so that rooting in central and eastern Washington and that rooting in the private sector as opposed to being a career politician is something a lot of those undecided voters like.
One of the things that have really come to forefront, we were kind of talking before we started, some of the recent issues that have come about with the state, whether it's the Department of Corrections or a lot of things to do with the Department of Transportation. What are some things that perhaps you would bring in that could kind of correct some of these things? Or, I mean, we hear so much about the Bertha project and all that. What are some ideas that you have for getting these things back on track?
Well, as you pointed out, John, we have a lot of broken bureaucracies in Olympia right now, and that's because we don't have any effective leadership in the governor's office. We have, as you pointed out, a Department of Transportation that has projects that are going over budget, delayed, behind schedule, and now we have a situation on 405 where the government is actually creating traffic jams in order to engineer people into toll lanes. We have a Department of Corrections that's illegally releasing prisoners early. We have a Western State mental hospital the federal government is about ready to move in on because of repeated mismanagement at the state level, and that's in the governor's office. And then an issue that would have gotten more attention, but because of transportation and corrections really hasn't, but otherwise it would be on the front page, is that the governor's healthcare authority has underestimated our healthcare costs by several $100 million. Last year and the year before, the legislature was concerned about the numbers coming out of the governor's office, and so they put in money to bring in an outside actuarial to look at the projections just to get a second opinion, and the governor vetoed that and said it wasn't necessary. Well, right after this session began in January, they had to admit that, they had been using the wrong numbers, and they're somewhere between $400 and $600 million over budget. So we have a lot of mismanagement that all is at the feet of the governor, and we need a new governor who can actually bring some private sector executive management skills to running the state.
It appears from at least the stories that are getting a lot of the headlines, it appears that a lot of the agendas that Inslee has tried to push have not necessarily been popular, but one would get the idea that the Senate Majority Caucus, that group of GOPs with the two Democrats, it almost appears that they have the most political clout, and they are almost the ones that seem to be leading the state. For example, Inslee's cap and trade policies and a lot of other ideas, they seem to make it through the democratically controlled House, but they absolutely hit the wall in the Senate. And it appears that the Majority Caucus it's almost like they're running the state instead of the governor.
That's very true. They are setting the policy for the state. And I would argue that the governor would be even more unpopular if you didn't have the Republican majority coalition in the Senate keeping him from advancing some of the ideas that he would like to advance. I think that if he were able to put through a lot of his program, he'd be even more unpopular than he is. So on the policy side, yes, the Senate is really driving the agenda. But the Senate cannot run the government on a day-to-day basis. And that's really what the governor needs to do. And when you have problems in foster care, or you have problems at Western State Hospital, or a Department of Transportation that can't deliver projects, or a corrections agency that is not releasing prisoners on time and doesn't know how to calculate when they should be released, that's because you don't have executive management in the governor's office. And only the governor, the Senate, can't do that.
Are you finding that a lot of people, when they look at these issues and when you talk with them, are you finding that your campaign is gaining momentum over that? Because, you know, it's been a long time since we've had a Republican or GOP or kind of a fresh voice in the state capitol. What are you sensing from people as we head towards November?
Oh, as we head towards November, what I'm sensing is that people don't really care if you're a Republican or Democrat. I mean, some do, but a lot of them don't. They just want a governor who can fix problems. And they see that this governor is very singularly focused on climate change and, you know, flies off to Paris to think big thoughts about global problems. But at the end of the day, they want a governor who makes sure traffic moves, that kids are learning and schools are working, that prisons are working. And those day-to-day activities that affect people's lives is what they want to work well. They want a governor who can make the government better, not bigger. And his solution, whenever there's a problem, is to first blame other people, then defend the status quo, and then he falls back on, well, what I need to do is hire more people, create a new program, and raise your taxes. And people are tired of it. Across the state, we're getting crowds that are much larger than we expected. You know, the staff will say, well, there's going to be 30 to 40 people here, and there'll be 50. Or the other night, we were expecting 40 to 60, and there was 110. People want a governor who will help fix problems.
Are you finding similar momentum building on the west side as well? Because I know you do have a lot of experience and you're well known over there because of the business and the port and all that. But one of the greatest obstacles for someone who tries to go up against an incumbent, you know, such as Inslee or Gregoire, is what a lot of people on our side, and perhaps even other parts of the state away from Seattle, perceive as the King and Pierce and all that county establishment. Are you finding some good momentum right there on the more populated side as well?
I am. I was meeting with some small business people over in West Seattle just last week, and these are people who have always voted Democratic. I also met with some people who live up on Capitol Hill who are definitely very, progressive or liberal Democrats. And in both groups, they were saying it's time. Even among those groups, they were saying having one party control the government for 34 years is too long, and it's time for a reasonable, pragmatic Republican to go in there and just clean up the place. And so when you have people, even in the progressive left, saying, you know what, it's time to have a pragmatic alternative to what we've had, then you can tell that things are turning. And crowds over there as well as over here are increasing, and I think that's because people know it's time for a change.
And perhaps some of that could be tied to, you know, you said people aren't as worried about the D or the R, but they're more concerned with someone who can get things done. And I think that ties into nationally as well. people feeling disenfranchised and left out of the system. They're frustrated, and I would imagine that your message resonates with them as well. People just are fed up.
They're fed up, and they don't think that either party really represents them, and they're looking for somebody who will put the good of the state and focus on fixing problems ahead of partisan politics. And that's what I've done in the 8 years that I've been in public office, twice been elected in King County. I've really focused on just solving the problems. And today, I'll tell you, I spent all morning out at Hanford and really looking at the cleanup activities that are going on out there and talking to people on different sides of the issue, just so I get a better sense of where we are and really how we can pull people together to fix this. Do we really need to spend the next 40 years in court battles, or can we pull people together and put together a plan to begin moving forward, not only on cleaning up the site, but to begin discussing what's going to happen with that property after we've cleaned it up?
Yeah, because, well, most people are quite aware that it's not going to go anywhere. It's going to stay there. Should things go the way that you would hope they would in November at the polls, what would be, maybe you could outline for us, do you have kind of an idea when you took office, okay, we're going to start with this and this and this, kind of an outline?
You bet. On day one, we are going to launch a 4-year program. It's going to take 4 years to finish it, but we are going to launch a 4-year program to entirely rebuild the budget from ground zero. Entirely re-examine the state bureaucracy, every department, every agency, every program, and every tax incentive. We're going to identify where we want the state to be in terms of job generation and other priorities, and then we're going to evaluate those departments, agencies, programs, and tax incentives against those 10-year goals. And we'll build the budget from zero. That hasn't been done in decades. What we've been doing year after year is taking the previous year's budget and adding to it. And we need to evaluate whether or not some of the programs we created 20 years ago are programs we still want to continue to fund. And over the course of the first 4 years, we will entirely rebuild the budget.
It's kind of like what a business does when, say, a new CEO takes over a struggling company. They go through and they evaluate everything from the mailroom to the top and say, okay, how can we operate more efficiently, more leanly, in a more lean manner? So that's kind of one of the first approaches.
Well, and just make sure that we're still spending, or that we are spending money in a way that's consistent with our current priorities. I bet you will find out that we developed some programs in the 70s and 80s that met the needs of that time, but maybe are not as necessary in 2016 or 2020. Let's redevelop the bureaucracy in our programs to meet the needs of our time.
Absolutely. Well, I would imagine that would keep you certainly busy. And any ideas that perhaps by doing so, the state would find that they've actually got enough money to meet a lot more of the financial obligations that everybody, like with McCleary, where are we going to get the money for this, the money for that? Do you think that by cleaning up this whole process, you would find the state has a lot more available money?
What that exercise will force is priority setting. Now, the Constitution forces the first priority on us, and that's education. It's the paramount responsibility of the state to amply fund education. So let's fund education first. Let's not keep squabbling over how we're going to fund education and hold kids' education hostage to some tax increase. We have the money that we're collecting from the general fund. Let's take what we need of that for education. That will then force a conversation about what we're going to buy or pay for with the money left over. And that conversation about priorities has not occurred in decades, and it needs to happen. And in that conversation, we'll find that we're probably paying for a lot of things we don't need to be paying for.
Well, I know that in the private sector, that is a conversation that happens all the time, is priorities. A business says, well, can we afford to buy a new vehicle or hire people? What are the priorities? So I know that a lot of people, regardless of the races, you're hearing in a lot of other political areas as well, this idea of the private business model being applied to government because it's needed.
It is. Now, I've built a company, and then I was elected in King County, and I've seen how government works. Government can't always operate like a business because you have different priorities.
Yeah.
In business, you're there to make a profit. Provide a good service to your customers, but you're also trying to make a profit. There are times you're going to do things, a lot of times you're going to do things in government that don't make a profit in dollar terms, but benefit the community. So you have to evaluate the benefit differently than just dollars and cents. purpose. But if you go into it with that understanding and you know what you consider to be a benefit, and you know what the objective of every program is, then you can decide whether those programs are meeting their objective or not. And if they're not meeting the objective, cutting them isn't hurting anybody, right? So if you got a program that's not meeting its original objective, either cut it because it's not serving the original purpose, or fix it. But you can't even know whether you need to fix it until you've evaluated it, and that hasn't happened in Olympia in far, far too long.
Absolutely. Now, you've been keeping a very busy schedule, and we thank you for taking the time with us today on News Talk. What are some important events or places you're going to be headed to in the coming weeks and months? Just basically everywhere that you can get to.
Well, I will tell you that I'm going to be spending a lot of time in Benton and Franklin counties because, well, I think a lot of folks over here think it doesn't matter whether they vote or not because King County is going to decide it. That's wrong. If people in Benton and Franklin County voted in the same percentage as people in King County, Benton and Franklin would have a lot more say in who gets elected in November. I can tell you that if Benton County, for example, and Franklin County had voted in the same percentage as King County in 2004, Dino Rossi would have been elected governor well out of recount territory.
Yeah, it was very close.
We've identified a lot of folks here who we believe would have voted for Rob McKenna in 2012, but just didn't turn in a ballot. And so we're spending a lot of time here working with those people. A lot of them are those sort of more undecided, less political folks, and letting them know that their vote matters. And if they want to change in Olympia, they need to vote for Bill Bryant in November.
Well, again, we thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule here on News Talk 870. Until next time, be listening for our next edition of Keeping Our Eye on Politics right here. Until next time, make sure you join us for another edition of Keeping Our Eye on the Politics of Washington with News Talk 870.